Welcome back to Wake Up Vermillion. I'm your host, Rachel Newville. Today we'll be talking about First Amendment and free speech issues with Gene Policinski, the COO of the Freedom Forum. Gene has an extensive career in journalism, as he was one of the first editors of USA Today. He currently speaks across the country on free speech and First Amendment issues. To start out, since the 2016 elections, on college campuses, there's been a lot of talk about free speech, First Amendment, how that all kind of fits together with a college campus.
Sure.
Could you just give us a little bit of background as an expert in this field as to how all those pieces fit together?
We've actually been doing a lot of work on college campuses and free speech, so it's one of the projects of the Freedom Forum Institute that I run. What we really find is that there is a lot of confusion on college campuses about exactly what can or should be said. Free press is almost another matter. It's getting confused, I think, with social media, and you know, there's some questions on a lot of campuses about the actual role of student media anymore, where once it was the way you found out what was going on campus and you kind of you know, talked to each other through it. Now with social media, that role is a little more diminished. So you have a harder job on this campus, and most editors and anchors and other people do, is really trying to figure out what's your proper role. But back to free speech for a second. You know, we find that unfortunately, we haven't taught a lot about free speech in this country for a couple of decades. And so you really find a lot of college students don't understand that the point of free speech is really sometimes to hear things that you don't want to hear.
I think there's a lot of students that just kind of ask, why should I care about free speech? Or why is this something that I should be paying attention to?
Well, you know, we have it so that we can talk to each other. It's interesting. I was actually on a program the other day and somebody asked that question for the world at large. And I said, well, it's not really. The glib thing is, and I say it sometimes, you can say what you want. Actually, the point of free speech from our founders was that we could speak to each other without the government interfering with us. Because remember, the First Amendment only restrains the government. It doesn't restrain private employers or your mom and dad or whatever else. But the point was to be able to talk to each other, sometimes very bluntly, sometimes in very irritating or angry tones, sometimes insultingly. But with some measure of civility, but with the goal of arriving at the best possible solution for the greatest number of people in the shortest amount of time. That's why we have free speech. If you take that and back it up into conversations, I think it's easier to understand that we may have a disagreement over tuition or the food that's being served in, you know, this or that place, or our political leaders. And I, living in Washington, see a lot of people who have to worry about that 4 a.m. knock at the door where the secret police have showed up because of something you said on your cell phone. You know, and thankfully we don't face that. We have other issues around free speech, but not that one. But it's very real in so many countries where, you know, if you like or don't like Donald Trump or the mayor in Vermillion, or and you say the wrong thing in some countries, you may actually hope that you get only the knock on the door because somebody might just put a bullet through your head. I was talking to a group of foreign journalists, about 300 who were here on a State Department program, and there was a gentleman, and I remember now, out from me into the back from Pakistan, and he stood up and he literally said, okay, Mr. Free Speech guy, I'm a journalist, free press, free speech guy, and if I print what I know, they won't just kill me, they'll kill my family, they'll kill the people who own the places where I shop. What do I do? And, you know, so I said I've never faced anything like that. But you've asked me a question, I'll try to answer it. And that is that maybe today you can't speak. Maybe you make a record of what you know, but preserve that record. But if you're going to die today because of what you said last night, I would say don't speak. And I would rarely caution somebody, but that was the honest answer. Well, that stayed with me probably now 10 years or more because when people ask me what's the value of free speech, I think, you know, that we have the luxury of asking that question. You know, that man didn't. We don't worry about what we say on the phone, what we say to our friends. A lot of places in the world, they do. The last time the Freedom House updated their map of press freedom in America, or in the world, we have that in the museum in Washington, 13% of the world's population lives in a country where the press is totally free to operate. And if you look at the map, there are blotches of green in North America and Western Europe, and not many other places, Australia. It's pretty rare to have the freedoms we have. So when I hear that, I understand that question, but I get a little wound up about it.
Definitely, definitely. So talking about kind of political climate around the world, but also in America, there's been a lot of talk about topics outside of free speech too, but things that have happened because of the Trump administration. And I think a lot of people like to throw that, the Trump administration onto this. And journalism has been seen, like the field of journalism, there's a lot of hostility towards journalists since the 2016 election. Have you seen things like this before, or is this a new phenomenon?
That's a great question because I have seen it before when I was a young journalist, but I've also, in my later years, seen it before Trump was in. I mean, the Obama followers often were very critical of any negative thing about the president or Michelle Obama. So, you know, the Trump has taken it to a new height, and he's gotten personally engaged with this bogus enemies of the people thing and all that. But I was your age, probably, covering George Wallace as a political candidate, right-wing guy in the 60s and early 70s, actually. And I remember those audiences in little theaters that we'd go into or little auditoriums in the Midwest, and you'd hear the same things that reporters now hear at Trump rallies. You know, liberal scum, you know, and I have to say we probably, either I was naive as a young person or we just were more comfortable in our skins in America those days. We didn't really fear for our safety other than getting shoved, or they used to serve Coke in little paper cups. And the kind of wax cup, and they would wad those up and throw them. Sometimes they'd come over your head, you know, from behind. But Wallace was no Trump. He would actually, in the middle of his speech, very often say, like, I don't mean these people, and it was all male. So he'd say, I don't mean these boys down here. They're with me every day, and they write what I say, and then he'd launch into his equivalent of Trump's slogans and say, it's their editors in New York. Actually, would say they're damn editors in New York. And the crowd would applaud. So coming in, you'd get maybe the shove or the nasty comment. Going out, you'd almost get the pat on the back saying, George says you're okay, you know. So I remember that. It was every bit as vitriolic going in as the Trump rallies. But Wallace was smart enough to turn it into something at the end that was a little bit different.
I mean, on the flip side, there's also been Trump clips saying to kind of open up libel laws. So he can sue these papers and different things like that. What would that process look like for him to do that? And is that actually a real threat?
Again, excuse me, a really good question. I think when he said it, people took him to mean, you know, I think he said, I'm going to change the libel law. And federal, well, there is no federal libel. It's a libel law is a state law, so you've got to change 50 states plus the D.C. circuit. However, you can short circuit that by doing something that Clarence Thomas suggested the other day, which is go to the Supreme Court and attack Times v. Sullivan, 1964 decision that really gave you wider latitude when you report. And we have to be careful how we say this, to report on public figures, and certainly elected officials, with a degree of error, inadvertent error. It is not, as the critics would say, licensed to lie or defame. What it means, though, and the reasoning of the decision was, if you and I were talking about things, and let's say you're running for office and I'm asking you a question, and this is not true, but you have had a serious driving violation in your background that most people don't know about. And I say, I understand you were arrested for drunk driving, whatever. And it wasn't. It was for speeding 25 miles over the... Well, I had seen a report in a newspaper from that era that said it was a DWI charge. And of course, they later ran a correction I didn't see. It's an error. I probably would not successfly be sued by you for making that error. I worry that if you take away Times v. Sullivan, you're going to have the chance to sue me, not because I defamed you necessarily, but you know, you were pled guilty to some crime, but I had my facts wrong. So Times v. Sullivan involved an ad in which there was error. And the court really said, if you're going to have a vigorous public debate without citizens being afraid that they're going to be sued every minute for making an inadvertent error, the only way you really lose now under Times v. Sullivan, if you're a news operation, is if something called malice, absolute malice. Actual malice, and that's not just being angry, as a lot of people would take it. It means that you either carelessly disregarded the truth, you might have heard it and didn't pay attention, or that you intentionally didn't look for a truthful verification. So most news organizations do their work, they make a mistake, they correct it, they don't be sued. We do one last thing, if I might. People tend to see this as news organizations versus politicians. But again, Times v. Sullivan protects us. If we stand up at a meeting in Vermillion and at the town council, or if, Sioux Falls or in the South Dakota legislature, and we make a statement that somebody says defamed a legislator, and we have most of our facts right, but we make one error, it really protects us. Journalists only have the protection as any other citizen would have it.
Yeah.
So I worry that this is going to be defined as a, big media versus the White House. It's not. It's you and me and our right to stand up and say something and be critical of our government without fear of being sued every time we do it. And I hope that we keep that in mind when we watch the Supreme Court, if in fact they follow up on Justice Thomas's suggestion.
Yeah, you mentioned journalism being a watchdog on the government. There's a lot of claims that journalism has become so partisan in its reporting. Right. Do you think that most of your big news organizations are still being responsible watchdogs?
Oh, I do. I think, frankly, when you get into most networks, for example, I think they've got to worry about a big enough demographic that they want to be all things to all people. The last thing they want to be is on one side of the divide or the other. You go to cable TV, no, there are niche markets. MSNBC, Fox, CNN fits in there somewhere. And they, but even there, if you look at the Fox News versus Fox Pundit, Fox News is very much more often than people imagine critical of President Trump. Or they will say there is no crisis at the border, and they'll present a news report. What really is partisan, I think, is the punditry that goes on. Fine, as long as it's labeled as opinion. I just worry that there's so much of it, it's so pervasive, and we, again, as news consumers, have not properly separated out that it's just Rachel's opinion or Tucker's opinion, and we treat that as somehow news. It's not. It's just somebody's opinion. And the industry doesn't help when the reporters for certain publications, and again, it's conservative and liberal, they write a news story today and they're being a pundit at night. And I don't blame people for being confused. I think we would do journalism and the country a favor if reporters stuck to reporting and pundits became pundits. And if you crossed over to one, at least you don't flip around during the day between those two roles. I do think that there's a real problem with how news is perceived. And of course, then it's all amplified on social media and it gets out.
So you have been in journalism for a long time.
50 years this spring.
Wow.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
It started when I was 19.
Yeah.
I used to say 9, but nobody believes it. I started when I was 19 at the Greenfield, Indiana Daily Reporter.
Wow.
In May of 1969, so only a few months away.
50 years of journalism
50 years
experience.
of journalism.
How have you seen it evolve in that time?
Well, I got in on what was the very last part of the technology, and I think almost the approach that had you been a printer or a reporter in the late 1890s, you could have come into that back shop at the Greenfield paper, which was letterpress and hot lead and all this stuff. The technology had been around for 80, 90 years. With about an hour's instruction, you probably could have sat down and gone right to work. Likewise, with journalism, you tended to go out and do institutional coverage. You might have done the occasional feature. You covered cops and robbers. You covered automobile accidents, at least in a small town daily. Sadly, most newspapers didn't worry about diversity. And it was very much still the province of, I like to say, cigar-smoking middle-aged white guys.
Yeah.
And that was the environment into which you came. Now, I came in at the end of the real push in the 50s and 60s of the civil rights movement. So we were beginning to think about diversity even then. But honestly, it was more race-based diversity than it was for women at that point. I think the consciousness had been raised at that point about Black Americans. But even then, not so much about Latinos and Asian Americans or whoever. Most women were still relegated. The second paper I was at, which is a slightly larger Indiana daily, had women who had been hired in the 20s and 30s, I think because the wages were so low that only women would work for them. And they had stayed around for 30 or 40 years. And then women in the, what was still called the society section, I think.
Okay.
And I swear to you, there was a regular newsroom and a little room off to the side in which there was literally like a carpet and little pink lights. And I mean, it was marriage announcements and so-called women's news. Within 4 or 5 years, that began to disappear.
Okay.
I do think today, the irony is, even as we've lost our advertising and circulation strength, the money that pays for all that, journalists like you are better trained than ever before. They're more adept at what they do. They're better at it than we were. I'm at that age, I'm absolutely positive. And we see so much more diversity in so much more media, although we have a long way to go still. You know, I'm ashamed to tell you, I think the industry had set a goal in the 70s to be certain places by the year 2000 or whatever, fallen far short of those goals. And now the reason as well as the excuse is, look, we're laying people off or firing people or retiring them. You know, don't talk to me about hiring. The flip side of that are people who under their breath whisper, don't worry, demographics will take care of it. Our society is changing, but that is a slow process.
Yeah.
I think for a free press to survive in the 21st century, we have to be representative of the audience to which we report. And we also can't stand again for what was, I'm sure, accepted knowledge and target audiences in Greenfield and Marion of that era, of going after a white audience that was probably affluent a little bit or middle class and up. You know, I think you have to go after affluent people of color, communities of color, but also low-income communities of color and whites. We can't afford to live on a slice of audience anymore. And I think if you don't cover people with some knowledge, they're going to decide you're irrelevant to them. I'm hoping as an industry we haven't crossed that barrier irrevocably, and then we can come back. We have to have diversity in our media or it won't survive.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Overall, are you hopeful that free speech will kind of stay where it is, or are you a little bit leery that some of that will be kind of taken away a little bit?
Well, you know, to be honest, and I'm going to think if that's my camera, I'm going to look and I'm going to say, that's going to depend on you as much as it is you or me. You know, we only have free speech and free press to the degree that the American people defend it. We have to see the value in it. We have to see the reason that we need both, which I think is incredibly important in a participatory democracy. You know, you and we cannot make the right decisions about our government if we don't know what our government is doing. And I believe most people in government are honest and competent and good, but I also think it's asking them a lot to report on their critics with the same vigor or their mistakes as they do their successes and their advocates. We need a fourth estate. We need a press that is an advocate for good government and a watchdog on the government we have. We need the ability to speak freely and not let government come in and say, you know, that, yeah, I know there's hate speech and we'd be a lot better off if these people didn't get to say that. No. As a citizen, I want to hear it. And I want to defend my values because I'm confident in the marketplace of ideas that my value will prevail. We surrender that, and I think we stop being Americans. I think the First Amendment and its 5 freedoms really define who we are as Americans. So I think that it's important for us, our mission to continue. I think it's important for people to refocus on these freedoms and don't take them for granted. We can see what happens, how easily in some countries they slide away. And frankly, a freedom lost is almost never a freedom regained, certainly within a generation. We cannot afford to have that happen here. So I'm hoping that people will pay attention, get involved, get engaged, defend these freedoms, and then do what you want. I mean, be a conservative, be a liberal, be a middle of the roader. I don't care. Oh, I do. I hope you're one of those things. But get involved, get engaged, use your freedoms, and defend those rights for others even when it hurts.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode.
My pleasure.
After the break, we'll be back with Wake Up Vermillion's Kelli Suzamil and Molly Spurlick to watch Kelli question students' knowledge and Molly's Game of the Week. Molly, and our campus correspondent, Kelly.
We're happy to be here, Rachel. This week I decided to play something a little bit easier than Battlefield 4, so stay tuned for that.
But first, I was curious to see if students knew what the First Amendment was, so I went around and asked them. Take a look. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution gives Americans the right to the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to assemble, and the right to petition. I'm here in the mock to see what students think the First Amendment is. What do you think the First Amendment is to the Constitution?
Freedom of speech, religion, and something else. Something along those lines.
2 for 5. 2 for 5.
The freedom of speech, religion, assembly, press, and there's another one. There's 5. I don't remember what the 5th one is right now.
What's the First Amendment?
I don't know.
Do you guys know what it is?
Right to free speech,
freedom of
assembly,
speech.
and freedom of religion, and freedom of the press.
4 for 5. 4 for 5.
Freedom of speech
Anything else?
and like freedom of press and freedom of religion and all that fun stuff.
She got it, all that fun stuff. I'd love to interview you. Wow, a volunteer?
Press, religion, speech, and there's 2 more. Petition, and something, I can't remember the other one. Let me see. Press, religion, speech, petition, right to assemble, peacefully assemble.
A team effort, but we love it. Thank you guys. Freedom of the press, boy.
Freedom of speech, freedom of religion,
Freedom of assembly.
freedom of the press. Religion, speech, press, assembly,
Petition.
petition. Okay.
What's the First Amendment of the Constitution?
Isn't the to protect our rights?
Yeah,
Like freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly.
What actually? No, that's it. That's it.
Turns out a lot more students knew what the First Amendment was than I thought. Honestly, if I wasn't a journalism major, I don't know if I would know myself.
I was impressed with how many people knew.
Honestly, I'm flattered.
So this week I decided to play a classic, musical chairs, but with a little twist my guest didn't see coming.
Hey guys, welcome back to our second segment of Games with Molly. This week we are here in the Al Newharth Freedom Forum to play blindfolded musical chairs. So hopefully no one gets hurt. The rules are simple. When the music stops, find a chair. Let's go.
Wait, we still have one more seat left.
Rule change, no more touching the chairs. It's okay. It's fine. It's all fair in love and war. You guys are clumped up.
Okay. It's too easy.
And there you have it. Blindfolded musical chairs. Sandra Bullock, where you at?
Honestly, I'm kind of surprised that no one got hurt filming that.
Honestly, I came a little bit close.
I'm just glad we didn't have to take anyone to the hospital. Thanks for joining us on this morning's Wake Up Vermillion. We would like to extend a huge thank you to our guest, Gene Policinski.
We'd also like to thank Coyote News for letting us use their studio.
Don't forget to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Have a great day, Vermillion.